Titus was a warrior of the Ultramarines chapter of the Adeptus Astartes who served his chapter loyally for over 200 years. Somewhat unusually for an Ultramarine, Titus did not believe that the tenets of the Codex Astartes were to be interpreted literally, nor should they be followed to the letter, despite the Codex being penned by the Ultramarines Primarch Rabute Guilliman. Instead, Titus believed that the Codex, while offering sound advice, was somewhat open to interpretation, and that following the spirit of the Codex was more important than being limited by its rigid doctrines. During a campaign against the forces of Chaos, Titus would be the sole surviving member of his squad following an encounter with a powerful Chaos sorcerer. Titus was grievously wounded by the attack, but would succeed in slaying the psyker, avenging the deaths of his brothers in the process. This conflict would later see the death of the Second Company's captain, and Titus would eventually be chosen to act as his successor. Despite being brash, short-tempered, and highly aggressive during his youth, the burden of command bestowed upon Titus would forge the young Ultramarine into a mature and highly respected member of the chapter, despite his unconventional views towards the Codex Astartes. Titus would be best known for his actions during the liberation of the Forge world of Graia, where he would lead the forces of the Ultramarines' Second Company to reinforce the 203rd Cadian Shock Troopers Imperial Guard Regiment against an invading Orc horde led by the war boss Grimskull. It was during the course of this campaign where Titus would discover a distress call from the Xanthite Inquisitor Drogon of the Ordo Xenos, who was in the process of developing a weapon known as the Psychic Scourge. The Psychic Scourge was designed to eliminate entire Xenos armies by targeting the unique warp signatures exhibited by a particular species, and initial tests upon Orc, Tau, and Tyrannid organisms yielded promising results. The core of this device was a small yet exceptionally potent power source that was derived from the energies of the warp itself, and prolonged exposure to this power source was speculated to inevitably lead to corruption. Despite being initially intended as a weapon to wield against Grimskull's hordes, the Scourge, when fully activated, opened a warp portal that allowed the Chaos Lord Nemeroth and his warband of heretic Astartes to manifest upon Graia. It would be revealed that Drogon had been dead for several weeks, and that his corpse was being puppeted by a demonic entity under Nemeroth's control. Nemeroth attempted to obtain the Scourge's power source, intent on using the artifact to ascend to demonhood. While Titus and his men succeeded in keeping the Chaos Lord from acquiring the power source for a time, Nemeroth would eventually come to possess it, slaying Sergeant Sidonus in the process. As Nemeroth began his ascension to demonhood, Titus would succeed in slaying the heretic during his transformation before shattering the Scourge's power source, which in turn sealed the warp rift that was engulfing Graia. Despite his heroic actions, Titus would be taken into custody by Inquisitor Thrax, following Brother Leandros' accusations of heresy towards his captain, due to Titus being seemingly unfazed by the corrupting energies emanating from the power source. While his fate following this is unknown, Titus would be given the honor of having a statue erected within the Ultramarines Hall of Heroes upon the crag. The rank of second captain would later be bestowed upon Cato Sicarius. If the power source of the Psychic Scourge was indeed capable of corrupting those who are exposed to its energies, then why wasn't Titus himself corrupted? Some have suggested that the reason behind Titus remaining uncorrupted by the Psychic Scourge's power source is due to the possibility that Titus is a type of being known as a blank. Blanks, also known as pariahs and untouchables, are exceptionally rare individuals that are for all intents and purposes soulless. While the majority of humans produce a psychic echo within the warp due to the presence of their soul, blanks by contrast do not, instead nullifying the energies of the warp around them. It is this particular characteristic demonstrated by blanks that makes them valuable weapons to wield against psykers, due to their immunity to a psyker's warp-spawned abilities. For example, the Calexis Temple of the Officio Assassinorum uses blanks exclusively in order to assassinate powerful psykers and sorcerers such as the Farseers and Warlocks of the Eldari race. If Titus was indeed a blank, then this unique trait could have indeed shielded him from the corrupting influence of the warp-based energies exhibited by the Psychic Scourge's power source. However, this particular possibility is unlikely due to a number of reasons. Prior to obtaining captaincy of the Second Company, Titus, as stated within his character profile upon the Space Marine website, was severely injured by the Chaos Sorcerer that slaughtered the rest of his squad. While it was never stated explicitly how this sorcerer managed to cause such devastation upon an entire squad of Astartes, it would be reasonable to assume that the heretic unleashed the powers of the warp upon his foes. If this were indeed the case, then given the fact that Titus was injured in the conflict, this would seem to contradict the notion of him being a blank, since psychically based abilities become nullified when they come within close proximity to a blank's null aura. Admittedly though, there is always the possibility that Titus could have been wounded indirectly, such as by being bombarded with objects via telekinesis. Another piece of evidence that would make the notion of Titus being a blank somewhat implausible comes from Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno, with the following description regarding the pariah gene, the genetic marker of blanks.
There is also the observation that no Space Marine, or Custodian Guard for that matter, has ever been recorded as being a psychic null. This factor weighs the evidence of some scholars that within the Space Marine's gene seed itself is perhaps a shadow of the Emperor's own genetic material and a sliver of his own psychic power, crucial to the process and success of the transition from mortal to Astartes. If this is the case, it would be wholly an anathema to the pariah gene and likely simply kill its implanted subject.
As a result of this, it would appear extremely unlikely for Titus to be a psychic blank. So what other possible explanations could there be for Titus remaining uncorrupted by the Psychic Scourge's power source? The simplest and, admittedly, most likely reason behind Titus remaining uncorrupted could be due to the Ultramarines' sheer force of will. The spiritual corruption that comes as a result of prolonged exposure to the energies of the warp is inconsistent in how easily it can take root within a particular individual. Typically, those beings that are weak-willed will often succumb to such a taint at an accelerated rate compared to those who exhibit greater willpower or devotion to their faith in the Emperor. As such, Titus could have remained untainted by his prolonged exposure to the power source due to his mental and spiritual fortitude being exceptionally high, which in turn would allow him to resist its corrupting influence. This force of will could also provide an explanation as to how Titus was able to withstand the psychic powers of Nemeroth when the Chaos Lord attempted to immobilize Titus and his command squad shortly after the heretics set foot upon Graia. Such mental and spiritual fortitude is not entirely unprecedented within the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes, though such resilience typically comes as a result of intensive training. The Grey Knights chapter, for example, forces aspirants to undergo an exceptionally demanding and dangerous training regimen in order to shield their minds and souls from the corrupting influence of the Chaos Gods. Titus, however, as a member of the Ultramarines chapter, would not have endured this same procedure undertaken by the Grey Knights, though this does not necessarily rule out the possibility that Titus is simply a man who is exceptionally strong-willed and mentally resilient. But there is another possibility in regards to Titus's exposure to the power source, in that Titus showed no signs of becoming corrupted because such corruption had already taken root within the Ultramarine. When Titus's original squad was destroyed by a Chaos Sorcerer, The other members of his chapter would question just how Titus himself was able to survive such a devastating onslaught. Because of this, is it possible that his exposure to the powers displayed by a sorcerer of chaos had inadvertently sown the seeds of corruption within Titus's body and soul? The possibility that Titus had already been partially corrupted is hinted at by Nemeroth with the following quote: "Shortly after the Chaos Lord slew Sergeant Sidonus and obtained the power source for the Psychic Scourge."
You continue to resist my touch. Only a deep connection to the warp can explain this. Will you be joining us soon, brother?
If corruption had already begun to take hold within Titus's soul, this would explain as to how there were no visible symptoms of corruption from his prolonged exposure to the power source, although Nemeroth could have been lying about Titus's connection to the warp in an attempt to dishearten and sow doubt within the remaining Ultramarines. That being said, however, Titus's actions following Nemeroth's words could be due to the subtle influence of chaos steering the Ultramarine towards damnation. Titus himself would state that Nemeroth would be most vulnerable during his transformation to demonhood, which in turn meant, regardless of his justifications, Titus wanted Nemeroth to begin the process that would have him ascend to demonhood. But it is worth noting that the idea of a Chaos Champion being vulnerable during the process of their transformation into a demonic entity is not without precedent. Within the audio drama Censure, the Dark Apostle of the Word-Bearer's traitor Legion, Kurthus said, would be mortally wounded as he began his apotheosis. This would then transform the Word-Bearer into a Chaos Spawn that was swiftly slain by Captain Valgius and Sergeant Aeonid Thiel of the Ultramarines Legion. However, when Nemeroth was seemingly slain by Titus, the Chaos Lord did not devolve into a Chaos Spawn, despite supposedly being in the midst of his transformation, but instead would dissipate back into the warp. This would strongly imply that Nemeroth had been successful in achieving apotheosis, becoming elevated to demonhood thanks to the actions of Titus. As a result, could Leandros' claims of Titus being a heretic be justified? After all, it is often said that the seed of heresy rests in the minds of reasonable men. But what if Titus's connection to the warp was something other than chaotic taint? Could it be possible that Titus was in fact a latent psyker? Psykers are themselves known for having a strong link to the warp, using such a connection to draw upon its energies in order to manifest a number of different powers, such as telepathy, telekinesis, pyromancy, as well as many other devastating and esoteric abilities. While Titus was never documented as utilizing any of the many psychic disciplines, it is possible that this psychic potential only manifested later in life, if they had fully manifested at all. A strong psyker is capable of resisting the corrupting influence of warp energies, though usually only if a psyker has been trained in how to properly wield their abilities. Untrained psykers are in actuality more susceptible to the corrupting influence of the warp, and will often fall prey to demonic possession, or even have their minds transformed into gateways that allow the denizens of the warp to enter the material realm. If Titus was a latent, untrained psyker, this would suggest that the Ultramarine would have potentially shown greater signs of corruption as a result of his exposure to the energies of the Scourge's power source. Perhaps the truth is some combination of these aforementioned possibilities, that Titus is a latent psyker whose untrained and undisciplined mind had allowed the taint of the warp to take root within him after being subjected to the psychic assault of a chaos sorcerer, which in turn would inadvertently lead him towards aiding a heretic Astartes in their quest to achieve demonhood. Or perhaps the faith and mental fortitude displayed by Titus was so strong and unwavering that this former captain of the Ultramarines was simply the pinnacle of what a Space Marine should strive to be in order to better serve the Imperium. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.